Welcome, Sandra. Good to have you with us. I'll promote you to a panelist so you can participate, and we are also live now.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi,
Yay, good to see you.
hi, Sandra. How are you? Good to see
Hi,
you.
thank you so much. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely to see you too. And welcome, Susan. Susan, I'm sending you an invitation to become a panelist that would allow you to unmute and participate verbally if you wish. You can choose to keep your video on or off as a panelist. Just wanted you to understand what the panelist invitation means. And I'll put everyone on mute. Feel free to unmute whenever you'd like to actively speak, okay? We just want to keep background noise minimal during class. So just remember to unmute each time before you want to participate. So good afternoon. Really a big pleasure to be learning together as always. This class is part of Dresha Spring Zman, discussions on the Parashah. This week we have Pekudei with Rabbi Jon Kelsen, who is the Chief Education Officer here at Dresha. And yeah, with that, I'll turn this to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So I'll just say, Sandra, you're with us here in the room, and I see other people who are attendees, but maybe more will join. But we'll begin, and whoever is supposed to be here is here. So we are, and we distributed a source sheet, right? Does everybody have that? Terrific. So I'll tell you what, I'm gonna not screen share it at first, at least, and then if we need to, then we will. Thank you for putting in the chat, Evie. This way I can see people better. If we need to, then we'll screen share. Okay, so we are here at the end of Sefer Shemot, at the end of Sefer Exodus and Parashah Pekudei. And I thought that this afternoon, evening for me, Evie, I don't know what time it is for you, but morning, evening, afternoon, that we would take a look at primarily the end of the Parsha, which is the end of the book of Exodus, and do two things. One, try to take stock of where we are in the progression of the Chumash and the grand narrative, the grand arc of the 5 books of the Chumash. The truth is we'll focus primarily in that sense on the first 4 books. Maybe we'll mention Devarim, we'll see how it goes. So one thing is to take stock of where we are in the story, both looking backwards and forwards. And secondly, to focus on the final verses of the book itself, chapter 40 of Sefer Shemot, where, and this gets to the content of Sefer Shemot, we've been building the Mishkan thinking about constructing and then constructing the Mishkan for quite a while, basically the second half of the book, especially if you include the story of the Egel HaZahav, and it's actually constructed in Vayakel Pekudei, and Pekudei in great length, by the way. It's told not only the instruction phase, but also in the implementation phase. And at the end of the Parsha, the Mishkan is completed. And here you can look at your source sheets here, just to skim through the chapter 40, right? Moshe Limor, on the first day of the first month, B'yom HaChodesh HaRishon B'Echad HaChodesh, Takim et Mishkan Ohel Moed. Right, you should set up the tabernacle, set up the Mishkan of the tent of meeting. We'll translate it here, of the Ohel Moed, and you put there the Aron of the Edut, the Aron of the Ark of the Testimony, perhaps meaning that it holds the terms of the covenant, what we call the Torah. And then Moshe is told how to sanctify, to anoint and sanctify maybe appoint, we should say, via the anointing, the altar, the other kutraman, the other kelim, the other vessels of the Mishkan, and to sanctify the Kiddashta at the Mizbeach, for example, to do that not only for the physical or the material kelim, but also for the human kelim, if you will, that's to say the Kohanim, as in verse 13, V'hel bashta, you bring forward the Aaron and his sons, and you should dress them in the holy garments and anoint them and sanctify them as Kohanim. In verse 16, Moshe does so, Vayas Moshe, K'chol asher tziva Hashem oso ken asa. Moshe does so, exactly as God has instructed, to the letter. Moshe and Bnei Israel do so. And then in the first month of the second year, the Mishkan is set up and established. Vayaka Moshe Mishkan, towards the end of the parak, I'm skipping on the source sheet, verse 33. It's set up. Vayachal Moshe et Melacha, and Moshe has completed the Melacha. Moshe completes all of the construction. And the final verses, Vayachas ha'anan et ha'ol moed, u'chvod Hashem maleh et ha'mishkan. The cloud, not just a cloud, but the cloud. It's a cloud that we might recognize. We've heard of it earlier in the book, specifically at Har Sinai. The cloud, which bespeaks God's presence, covers the Ohel Moed, and the glory of God, or the Chavod of Hashem, fills up the Mishkan. Moses, interestingly, verse 35, Lo yachol Moshe l'vo Moed. Moshe is unable to enter into the Ohel Moed. Ki shachan alav ha'anan, for the Anan has dwelt upon it. Uchvod Hashem maleh et ha'mishkan, we're told again and again, the Chvod Hashem has filled it. Uvehalo Anan, we hear more about the Anan. I believe actually the term Anan here is going to appear no less than 5 times in these few verses. Uvehalo Anan me'al ha'mishkan, when the cloud would come up off of the Mishkan, Bnei Yisrael would travel. Yis'u Bnei Yisrael mechol ma'asehem, they travel all their ways. V'im lo ye'ala ha'anan, but if the cloud would not, depart, would get, leave, below Yis'u ad yom he'alato, then they would stay put until it moved, until it arose off the Mishkan. The final verse of Sefer Shemot, Ki anan Hashem al ha-mishkan yomam ve'esh alayla bo, for the anan of God was on, the cloud of God was on the Mishkan during the day, and the fire would be there at night. Leinei chol bnei Yisrael b'chol ma'asehem, in the eyes of all of Israel and all of their travels. And this is the end of Sefer Shemot. So let's take stock of where we are again, as I say in the Chumash. Where are we? And we mean that in a few different senses. I said looking backwards and looking forwards. If you're looking backwards, then we have 2 things preceding the end of Sefer Shemot. Those 2 things are, one, the rest of Sefer Shemot, everything leading into it, right? So the end of the book of Exodus tautologically ends the book of Exodus. That's one thing to think about. How does the book end, and how does that relate to its beginning and middle? And 2, we have the book of Reshit, of course, right? Because Exodus, Shemot, is the second book in the Chumash. But so how does it relate to everything that came before it? So let's talk about that for a little bit, and then we will look forward, as it were, and think about together how this ending of Sefer Shemot might gesture towards the coming books of Vayikra and Bimidbar. We'll see if we get into Devarim here, but primarily we're going to talk about Vayikra and Bimidbar. Okay, so looking backwards, we have the construction of the Mishkan. And I'll say, by the way, that as always, I'm deeply influenced by Rabbi Silver's teachings. So you'll probably notice several things I didn't claim these are all my chidushim by any extent. Many parts I'm just simply passing forward his insights. Some maybe complemented sometimes by my own and those of others. So on the one hand, we have the Sefer Shemot itself, and the end of Shemot, ending Sefer Shemot with the construction of the Mishkan. It's actually basically the second half of the book. It takes up a lot of ink and gets a lot of press. So how do we understand this book of Exodus, right? Exodus meaning, right, leaving Egypt. How do we understand a book about leaving Egypt, spending so much time on a topic which ostensibly is not about leaving Egypt, which is the construction of the Mishkan? And this is something Rabbi Silver has talked a lot about, and before him, others, and especially the Ramban. So on your source sheet, I wanted to bring to you the introduction of the Ramban to Sefer Shemot, just to show off, if you're able to show off hands. Are you familiar with this Ramban, the Ramban's introduction to the book of Exodus? Okay, so some of you are familiar. So, but it's worth looking it over again. It's one of the masterpieces of Ramban's commentary on the Chumash, or his introductions to the book. And I'll say here, this may be something not new to you, but I'll say that one of the really important contributions that the Ramban made in his commentary on the Chumash, one of them, he has several, but one of them is taking seriously the idea that it is a Chumash, meaning that it's made up. On one hand, it is one long book, but it's also with its sort of coherence throughout. But it's also subdivided into 5 Chumashim, into five 5 separate sections. And the Ramban takes seriously the idea that these are 5 separate sections, and that each one therefore has its own coherence, its own integrity, literary and thematic. Again, this is not even Ramban's own innovation, but the fact that there are 5 books is baked in from the get-go. And Chazal prefer various names or kind of nicknames, if you will, for these books of their own. So you see the fact that they call, let's say, Vayikra Torah Kohanim, right, or Devarim Mishnah Torah, for example. So you see that they are giving them their own names. That indicates that they're thinking about their respective foci and taking for granted that they are independent works as much as they also cohere into one larger Pentateuch. So that's one of the Ramban's contributions in his introduction to the Chumash. And his introduction to Exodus is really interesting. And here I'll turn to that introduction, which is the second source on your source sheets. I believe it's on page 3. So Ramban there says that as following. He says, now that we have finished Sefer Bereshit, Hishlim HaKatuv Sefer Bereshit, which is the book about the creation of the world, Sefer HaYetzirah B'chidush HaOlam, and the creation and formation of everything, which is everything created. And he includes in there, interestingly, not only the physical material world, if you will, or the natural world, but also the creation, as it were, quote unquote, of the patriarchal family, right? That there's a sort of a creative element to the creation of the patriarchal and matriarchal family. So that's to do with Sefer Bereshit. That's not our topic right now, but it says after we've done that work of creation, I'm on the 3rd line there. Hitchil Sefer Acher be'inyan ha'maaseh haba min ha'remezahim. We start with the next book, which emerges out of and follows patterns which you find in the first book. V'nityached Sefer ve'ela Shemot. And this book, the second book of the Chumash, which is Sefer ve'ela Shemot, focuses be'inyan hagalut harishon ha'negzar b'feirush u'v'geula mimenu. It focuses on the realization of the first exile. Remember that Abraham is told that his descendants will be, strangers in a land not of their own, and be there, suffer there for many, many years. So the 4th generation will return. So the book of Exodus, he says, is about that first exile and about the redemption from it. Okay, and this is why we call it Exodus, and this is familiar to us, right? The story of enslavement. Matchilim mignut Mitzrayim b'shvach, and story of enslavement. Abadim hayinu lefarov Mitzrayim, and then we are redeemed from there. The thing is, though, as he notes in the beginning of the next paragraph, is that this only carries you through about half the book, because once they cross the sea, Pharaoh is dead, the Egyptians are gone, and Bnei Israel are now a free people. So the book could have stopped with that at that song, but it doesn't. It continues with 2, I guess, major occasions. One, Ma'amad Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and all the sort of the things that come before and the pieces after, and also and then of course the construction of the Mishkan. Again, that includes it's the instructions for the construction, the Egel HaZahav story, the golden calf narrative, the second Luchot. That great story, and then the construction of the Mishkan itself. So what's that all about? So he says, well, v'hinei hagalut einenu nishlam, probably should be like the Geula, what it means here, right? But it means is that the exile isn't totally repaired, I guess is what he means here, right? The redemption is not complete, therefore. Ad yom shuvam al mekomam, until they, Israel, return to their place. Until they return to the level of the patriarchs. What does that mean? Well, what he means is that the story won't really be completed until they yashuvu hinu, until they return to this land. Now, that doesn't actually happen in the book of Exodus, as we know. It doesn't even happen in the Chumash, as we know. Right? That only happens after the Chumash, when they really start entering the land in earnest in the book of Joshua. But there is a place that they do come to, and this is going to be called. He talks about 2 places that they come to. but primarily I believe he means the Mishkan. He says as follows: when they left Egypt, even though they left the house of slavery, they were still considered in exile. Because they're still in not their own space. They weren't in Egypt's space, but they were in not their own land, that is to say, the desert. And then when they come to those two great locations, one, Har Sinai, and two, Vasu HaMishkan, and then God returns, Shav HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and God dwells amongst them. V'hishrav shchinato b'neihem. Right? V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a sacred place, so that I might, then I will dwell amongst you. So at that point, when God dwells amongst them, then they have completed, at least at one stage, the level of the process of redemption. They're considered Geulim, they're considered redeemed, and they've returned to the level of the patriarchs, meaning they've come back. Yeshuvu Hena, they've circled back to the patriarchal narrative and the patriarchal level, because now they are with God. And God is with them. And that's why the book ends with two things. One, with the construction of the Mishkan, and two, God filling it continuously and constantly. That is to say, God residing amongst the people, in a sense, residing through the works of the people. They are the chariot, as he says, the chariot for God's presence in the world, just like the patriarchs were. And that is the process. That is the end of the process of redemption. Okay, so this is a celebrated Ramban, a celebrated text, and it's worth really returning to over and over again. It's a foundational text for encouraging us to think about its particular take on the arc of the book. It encourages us to think about potentially other ways of resolving the arc of the book itself. But it claims that the Mishkan is basically the end of the process of the redemption. And what we just read in chapter 40 of Shemot is really the end of the end, or the apex of that process, where God comes to join and live among the people. And here one could say many important things, right, and interesting things to notice about the flow of the book, which would complement the Ramban's presentation, I would say, right? So, for example, something that I'm fond of noting is that, when the Jews are maybe before myself and I go, right? Silber has noted often, right, that the book starts and ends with construction, but it starts with construction for Pharaoh and ends with a construction for God. That's to say, the building of the Mishkan. And those different constructive activities have their own certain characteristics. Notably, let's talk about two of them. One, in the beginning, Israel are slaves, they're avadim, right? They are conscripted and forced into labor. But importantly, in the building of the Mishkan, what's emphasized is the voluntary, the volitional nature of their activity, right? That they are bringing materials and volitionally engaging in this building. So they choose to build. The human choose to build for God. And two, when they build for Pharaoh, they're working in what's called avodat farech, which is sort of breaking labor, labor that's perhaps designed to break the slave, to break their psyche. It's deliberately unconstructive or non-constructive labor. It doesn't actually get you anywhere. I mean, they do build things for Pharaoh. They build storehouses and such. Ramses. But ultimately, the way the Chazal understand it is, work which is designed to break rather than to actually build something. And this is the exact opposite of the construction of the Mishkan. That's about building something, and the word there is notably, primarily at least, not avodah, but melacha, which is constructive. We might call it a world-building term, because that is the term that is deployed by the Chumash in the beginning of Bereshit. We'll get to this more in a moment. Right, when God creates nothing less than the world, right? God does melacha, right? And God finishes God's melacha, at the end of the 7 days before Shabbat, or the end of the 6 days, before the seventh day of Shabbat. So they are engaged in volitional and constructive, godly perhaps, and world-creating melacha in construction of the Mishkan. And I would want to note that it's interesting, what they build for Pharaoh are array miskanot, mem samech kaf nun, miskanot, the Pharaoh, which sounds kind of like Mishkan, but not, right? They build miskanot for Pharaoh, but a mishkan for God. And in between building the miskanot for Pharaoh and the mishkan for God, there is kind of a misstep, right? There's a constructive activity, but it's not a great one for the book, right? And that is, of course, the other thing that they build in the book, the Jewish people, that is, they build an egel, they build a golden calf. And that is an egel masecha, right? A molten calf. But masecha evokes, I would say, looking backwards, the arei miskanot lefaro, on the one hand. So it's kind of a pharaonic type of building. It's not a great thing to be building, of course. And also, on the other hand, it makes you think of the Mishkan. That is to say that it's the pseudo Mishkan, right? It's meant to be the thing, there's different understandings of what they're doing in building the egel. But one possibility is that they're trying to build something that, Eile Elohecha Yisrael asher they're trying to build something for God to sort of ride upon, right? It's like God rides upon the cherubs. Maybe God would sort of rest upon the egel. So they're trying to build a quasi mishkan, a place for God, but it's not the right kind, right? It's an idolatrous one, and this is part of a general kav machshava stream, a line of thinking which identifies the mishkan as a repair, right, for the egel. But looking, I'd say differently, is that the egel is a failed anticipation of the proper, structure for God to rest upon in Israel, which is the Mishkan. But instead, they build the egel masecha. So they go from arei miskanot to the egel masecha, and finally to the Mishkan. Right? Okay. Yeah, I see a hand. Debbie, yes. Please unmute. Yeah.
And for both things, they use a tremendous amount of gold.
Yes, exactly. There's many. Thank you. There's many. Yeah. There's many things to pieces here. But yes, the gold, and where did the gold come from? After all, if not right from the gold, right from the things that they took from Egypt itself, right? So they're bringing Egypt out of Egypt, right, and into the desert. Okay. Yeah. So more to say on that point, but thank you.
And they're trying to use it as a way as an intermediary to communicate with God, which I think is what the Mishkan in some way is. It's a way to find a derech to communicate with Hashem. But it's their initiative, and it's clearly wrong. They just don't get the system yet. But
right.
It needs to be refined. But they use the same material.
Yeah,
the Mishkan is replete with gold. It's
a very important insight, right? And what truly distinguishes the Mishkan from the egel is something worth really sitting on and studying. One difference, of course, is that one God commands, one God does not command, and one contains at its center the luchot, right, and the edut, and the other contains at its center it just is an egel. And so, but anyway, yes, much to think about. So it's a very important point. So listen, like I say, on the one hand, the end of Shemot obviously ends Shemot and relates to the general progression of the book. What I think is perhaps less often spoken about, although Ramban did allude to it just now in his own way, is that the end of Shemot also, could be understood as ending the Sefer Bereshit and Shemot. I believe actually now, right, Silver is giving for the past few years, right, a shir on Genesis to Exodus, right? And there's a reason for that, because the two come together to form, each is their own independent unit. The Chumash is overall a coherent unit, and Genesis and Exodus also have their own coherence. And if you look in your source sheet, someone who says this in a really interesting way, I think, is the Nitziv, and Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, famed co-Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva. So he, in his introduction to Sefer Shemot, says as follows. He says, and this is source number 3, Peticha the Sefer Shemot, Zeh Sefer Nekra b'fi Baalei HaMidrash Sefer Shemot. This book is called the Book of Names, right? Already in Chazal, the Bereshit Rabbah calls it that in many places, right? And Ramban calls it the Book of Redemption, as we just talked about. But he says, he notes that Rabbeinu the Bahag, right, in Sof, I mean, I think he might be High Gaon, but calls in his book Sefer Sheni, right? So he notes that some actually call it Sefer Sheni, the second book, right? And therefore, because he thinks the 5 books as follows: Bereshit, the second book, Sefer Kohanim, that's Vayikra, Chumash Pekudim, that's Bimidbar, and Mishnah Torah. So it's interesting that they all get names basically, besides numerical names, except for the second one. The second one's called the second one, Sefer Sheni. So he says, what's that about? He says he calls it Sefer Sheni because, and here in the next paragraph, where I underlined, Sefer B'yichud hu, this book specifically, hu Sheni l'Sefer Bereshit HaBriyah. Its focus is, like, this is what it is by its nature. It is the sequel, or the second book, following off of Sefer Bereshit, this book about the beginning of the creation. Hu chelik sheni mizeh sefer. It's actually kind of like part B of the same work. Hainu bo nigmar seder habriyah. How so? Because creation is really completed, he argues, in the book of Exodus. How is creation completed in the book of Exodus? Well, he says, look, Chazal say there's a few different drashot like this, but one drasha is Bereshit. This is from Bereshit Rabbah. Bereshit bara Elohim. So God created the world Bereshit, Bishvil Reshit, Bishvil Yisrael Shenikru Reshit. God created the world for the sake of Israel, who are called the first. Okay, this is a particular reading. We're just going to sort of try to understand what he's claiming here. What does that mean? His reading, Perush, Tachlita Olam Bechlalhu, Shetehei Uma Achat Chelak Hashem Amo, that the full realization of the telos, the raison d'etre of the world of creation, was the creation that there should be such a thing called Israel, God's nation. Now, I have to say, I'm a bit troubled by this notion, right? For 2 reasons. One, because of its parochialism, but 2, because when you read Sefer Bereshit, I'm not sure that you would think that God started off creating the world so that there should be winnowed down to one family. To the contrary, that seems to be, the result of a couple missteps or failed attempts, to work more globally until that point. But anyway, that's my gloss. But his claim is that no, actually Israel is or could be understood as being the Tachlit HaOlam, the Tachlit of the Bria. So if you make that assumption, or if you buy that claim, then it follows that claim isn't real. That purpose, telos, isn't realized until Israel becomes Israel, and they can't become Israel until they leave Egypt. Until they go down, right, as a family, but come out as a nation. They come out as Israel when they leave Egypt, and then they come into their purpose. Etc., right, to know God, etc. As he says at the final line there on page 3, Nimsa. Therefore, at the end of the day, Yitziat Mitzrayim, Haita Gemar Habriyah, Yitziat Mitzrayim, or maybe Matan Torah, he's willing to say, but something in the book of Exodus constitute the completion of the creative process, the completion of Sefer Bereshit. So that's an interesting idea. I want to take it in a different direction, actually, which is that that Sefer Shemot, especially in the construction of the Mishkan, perhaps, right, takes us back to Bereshit in a different way. The Ramban, as we noted, says, right, he has said that that Sefer Shemot completes the sort of, it's the realization of the Brit B'nai B'tarim, right, the covenantal promise that, in terms of the covenant, that your descendants will be strangers in a land not of theirs, and they're going to suffer there, and then the 4th generation will come back to here. Here happens in the book of Bereshit. Here is both geographically, spatially, the land of the patriarchs, right, the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and also unto their level, right, until their sort of relationship with God. But the Mishkan also, and this is also well noted by many, the Mishkan and its construction, especially the verses that we ended with, right? That's to say, the end of chapter 40 evokes not only the patriarchal narrative, I would say even more so evokes the story of the creation itself, right? At the beginning of the beginning, right? Chapter 1 of Genesis, maybe chapters 2 and 3 as well. Think about this again, right? That they construct Vayechal Moshe et Malacha. Moshe has completed the melacha, right? Right away there, the completing and the melacha reminds us, as we said before, of God's activity in the beginning of Bereshit, where God creates the world. Right? God has completed God's melacha, God's creative work, creative, constructive engagement in the Briyat Olam, creating the entire universe. And then God has the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath, God sanctifies it and blesses it, right? God blesses it and sanctifies it and mekadesh it. And here in the Mishkan, or the Mikdash, the place of Kedusha, we have Melacha deployed to construct a kind of world, and tellingly, Vayechal, it's completed. And here as well, if we're not surprised to hear about 3 things. 1, Shabbat. Right? Shabbat happens. Shabbat is mentioned in a few different places here, but it comes up in confluence with the construction of the Mishkan. Here, though, who is to observe Shabbat? In the beginning of Bereshit, who observes Shabbat, as it were? God. God observes Shabbat. God rests. God Shabboses, right, in the beginning of Genesis. In the book of Exodus, it's actually the human being who observes the Shabbat. It's also the human being who is engaged in melacha. 6 yamim ta'avod v'asita kol melachtecha. 6 days you should work and do all your melacha. Sounds a lot like the first 6 days of creation. And the 7th day, for Yom HaShvi, you're supposed to rest and observe the Shabbat unto God. So it's a human being who observes Shabbat in that context, and it's the human being who does 2 things in these contexts. 1, it's primarily the human being, whether it be Moshe or Israel, it's primarily human being in the book of Exodus who sanctifies. Kadesh li kol bechor, right? Zachot yom Shabbat lekadesho, and as we just read before, sanctify the kelim, sanctify Aaron, right? It's primarily the human being who sanctifies in the book of Exodus, as opposed to in the beginning of the book of Bereshit. It's also the human being who blesses, because Moshe, when they finish building the Mishkan, so Moshe blesses the people. Moshe blesses the people. Let me pull up that. Let me find that verse. Yeah, Vatachal, right? Vatachal, I call that Mishkan Ohel Moed. They're finishing all of the labor, and Moses, here it is, the end of chapter 39, which is not on your source sheets, but they complete the whole thing. Vayar Moshe et kol malacha v'hinei, and Moshe sees all of the malacha that they have done. V'hinei, and behold, which reminds us of God seeing the world. V'hinei, right? And it's good. And behold, here good is translated as asu otak asher tziva Adonai ken asu. They did it exactly as God has commanded, contra the egel. Vayevarech otam Moshe, and Moshe blesses them. So Moshe is the blesser here, as opposed to God. No, here's blessing the people, I understand, but in terms of blessing and holiness and shvita, observing Shabbat and doing melacha, all of this is done by the human being. This Rabbi Silver pointed out most of what I just said, but all of this is done by the human being. At the end of Sefer Shemot, in conversation with, in parallel with, but also in contrast with the construction at the beginning of the book of Bereshit. Now, it's not only the creation of the world that's created at large, that's created in the beginning of Bereshit, but it's also a specific place, right, where God is present, and that is Gan Eden. And this also has been noted by many, that in certain ways, the Mishkan seems to be an attempt to create kind of maybe it's a microcosmic Gan Eden, or maybe it's an imitation of Gan Eden, or maybe you could argue a full-fledged return to the Garden of Eden. I don't think it actually goes that far, and I'll try to explain why in a moment. But right, note, for example, that both contain at their center some kind of source of knowledge. And in the Gan Eden, it's Adat, the tree of knowledge, and in the Mishkan, it's what lies at the center is the thing which provides knowledge of God, which is to say the Torah, right, the Luchot. It's also the place where God speaks from and provides instruction. So that's the place where we know God's will. And before both, there are these cherubs, kruvim, right? Are sitting there before both. Now, in Gan Eden, the kruvim are blocking the way in, the road in, right? They're guarding the path with the revolving flaming sword. They're blocking the path to Eden once the human has been sent away from it. Perhaps similarly, again, I want to talk about this in a few minutes. We find in the Holy of Holies of the sacred, of the Mishkan, the Mikdash, kruvim on top of the Aron. There are cherubs there as well. These cherubs who are guarding the path, if you will, between the human comes forward and the tree of knowledge. Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. Right, we call the Torah the Eitz Chaim, not for nothing, right? The tree of life, the tree of knowledge. So, in a way, the Mishkan is an attempt to return not only to the land of Israel but to the original space, the space of the garden, right? In the garden, God is mitalech. God is walking around constantly there, and here, when God is willing to dwell there, so God is to be found there amongst the people as well. So, in a sense, we see that the end of Sefer Shemot both finishes up Sefer Shemot, right, in really important ways. It's the full realization, the redemption from the exile and the servitude of Egypt. But it also functioned as part B of a larger book called Bereshit Shemot. This at least is an Nitziv's claim, and we took it in a little different direction than Nitziv. But it could also be understood as part B of a book which begins with Genesis chapter, not only chapter 12, but chapter 1 actually, right now, the patriarchal story, but also with Bereshit itself. But a lot has changed between Genesis 1 and Exodus 40, right? We now have primarily the people doing the malacha, creating the space in which God will dwell amongst them, hopefully at God's instruction, true, but through their own construction. By the way, who's the primary architect? B'Tzalel, and that's also not for nothing, right? Because B'Tzalel evokes, B'Tselem Elohim, that the human was created by God right in the beginning. So just like God creates the world, so too B'Tzalel, the human being made in God's image, or standing in God's shadow, creates this Mishkan in which God could return and once again live amongst the people. So we have two grand paths leading backwards from the end of Shemot. But as we noted at the beginning, it also gestures forwards. And here I want to share, especially an insight of Rav Yoel ben Nun. This is on your source sheets. This is on your source sheet page source number 4 on page 4. Yoel ben Nun, a contemporary Israeli scholar, and I guess one of sort of the trailblazers in sort of what they call, this new way of or renewed literary readings, appreciation of Tanakh. So he notes two things. One I'll say orally, and one I'll say and one we'll read inside. He says two things. He says, first of all, as much as Vayechal Moshe Tamalacha, etc., evokes the beginning of Genesis, the Vayechal also sends us to the Har Sinai, sends us to the middle of the book of Exodus, right, where the Torah is completed and being given over to Moshe, and there we see, and Ramban actually noticed this, well before Yoel ben Nun, which is that that it seems very plausible, very likely that the Mishkan is meant to evoke not only the garden but Har Sinai, meaning it's meant to be a portable Mount Sinai, right? And just note that it, of course, is the receptacle. It's the place in which the Torah given on Sinai resides. It's the place where, remember, Revelation begins in earnest at Har Sinai, and this is the place that God continues to. God says that God will meet the human being there, and continue to speak to the human being from that place. And And it's also a place which is literally paralleled with Har Sinai, right? This is a place where the cloud covers the top of the mountain, the cloud covers the Mishkan, God's kavod comes onto the mountain. That means that Moshe can't enter until Moshe is called and beckoned in. All this is exactly like what happens in the end of our verses of Sefer Shemot, to Parashah Pekudei of chapter 40. So the Mishkan, as the Mishkan is set as constructed, it's like they're building a little portable Har Sinai. And then the same dynamic happens, right? That God comes in this cloud, and that precludes Moshe from entering until Moshe is sort of invited in eventually. And that is the place from which God will speak. So this Ramban noticed, right? And this allows God to dwell in their midst, just like God did at Har Sinai, perhaps interrupted by the construction of the Egel. But that's more well-trodden ground. But what he Yoel noticed, which I want to share with you, which I thought was a very simple and beautifully simple observation, is this business about the clouds at the end of, which we focused on before, at the end of the book. Like we said again, that the cloud covers the Ol Moed, and Moshe can't enter the Ol Moed, verse 35 of chapter 40. Lo yachol Moshe lavo Ol Moed. He was vayachal, he was able to successfully, if you will, complete the malacha, but he's v'lo yachol to enter the Ol Moed. Ki shachan alav ha'anan, because the cloud had covered it, and God's glory, kavod Hashem, the presence of God, filled it up entirely. And then it also says, almost like it's kind of like an afterthought. It's not clear, almost like a non sequitur. And when the Anan would be removed from or lift up from, rise up from upon the Mishkan, then they would travel and follow it. And if it didn't move, they wouldn't go anywhere. They'd stay with it. So Yoel Ben notes. I'm going to start reading inside from where what he has here on the source sheet. Then what he notes that the words Vayikra Moshe, the words that Moshe, right, could not enter into the Olam Moed to enter and to speak to God, right? That leads directly into the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. Why? Because if you read it as follows, read from verse 35 of Exodus, Moshe can't enter because God's presence was there, and God's presence has filled up the Mishkan. It's a lot like at Har Sinai until God calls Moshe from the cloud and calls Moshe in. So here too also, if you turn to Leviticus 1:1, Vayikra Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem elav me'ol ma'od lemor. But then God calls to Moshe and speaks to him from the Olam Moed, and you have the rest of the book of Leviticus. So on the one hand, right, these verses, especially verse 35, is basically, a introduction to, it's actually a very strong segue. It's an introduction to the book of Vayikra. You can't enter because the clouds are until God calls you, and then you can. That's at least one way of reading it. And then until God calls you, and then you can speak with God. Then maybe perhaps you can enter. That's on the one hand. What about these final verses in Exodus about the traveling and the Anan? Well, that gets you right into not the book of Leviticus, but rather a different book, which is the fourth book, Sefer Bimidbar. Because Sefer Bimidbar is exactly about that. It's about their travels following the Anan. And this gets picked up actually most clearly, he points out, not, the beginning of the book of Bimidbar. There's other things that happen there with the, setting up the Mishkan and inaugurating and all those types of things. But more here I have it on the source sheet, more in chapter 9, right? In chapter 9, verses 15 to 23, this is in the bottom of page 4 and onto page 5 of your source sheets. I mean, it's amazing. It actually seems to just pick up right after the end of Exodus. Yom Hakim et Mishkan, and the day that the tabernacle is set up, it's like a, repeats what it said before, it resumes and picks up again. The cloud covered the Mishkan, and then there was fire at night, and that's how it was. And they would basically travel with it and only with it. If the cloud stayed still, they would stay still. If it moved, they would move. And it's actually quite verbose here. It's interesting to puzzle over why. I don't fully understand it myself, except that it's trying to stress that in its sort of verbiage here, that the Chumash on stress in its verbiage, that the people really are following God here. They're really only traveling as God says. And sometimes they'll be sitting still. That means for, a day. And sometimes it means they'll be sitting there for 2 days or a month or a year. However long it is, they stay there. And if when God moves, they'll move. If God doesn't move, they don't move. They're as the prophet says, lechtech acharai b'midbar. You really walked after me. You really followed my lead in the desert, and only traveled with me. But be that as it's may, what Rabbi Jon notices, I think very compellingly, is that, his claim is very compelling, is that the end of Sefer Shemot kind of branches off as an introduction. It's the end of Sefer Shemot. It's the end of Bereshit Shemot. We said that at the beginning of our shir today, but it's also the beginning to 2 books. It's the introduction to Vayikra, and it's also the introduction to Bamidbar. So I think that's a really interesting observation there. And it made me think, now the truth is that Vayikra and Bamidbar are very different types of books, right? They work together, but, Shemot, it's almost like Shemot, there's like 2 possible follow-ups to Shemot, follow-up chapters, version A and version B. Version A is Sefer Vayikra, and version B is Sefer Bamidbar. Version A, Sefer Vayikra, is basically the story of, heavily, I would argue, at least as a hypothesis or something to mull over, it's basically a story of a Mishkan, which is sort of an end in and of itself, right? That is to say, it is the story of a world in which God can dwell amongst you, and everything you need to do to keep God's presence with you, right? Positively and negatively. All those halachot and all those korbanot and all the structures and all the purification are designed to allow, God's Mishkan to remain, and for God, therefore, to remain with you. That's like sort of the story of Sefer Vayikra, if you will, and it's relatively static when compared with the literal dynamism and movement of Sefer Bamidbar. That's a different story. That's a story of God being with you, yes, right? So it follows from Vayikra, but it's a different focus. It's about getting somewhere. It's about traveling as a camp and as a people around the Mishkan and led by God's presence to somewhere. And that somewhere is the land. Right? That somewhere is the land, which is never realized in the Chumash, but that is the somewhere else. So the stories are actually, or the books, I'd say, Vayikra and Bamidbar, I'd say, this is a generalization, maybe a gross generalization, but there's something to it, I think, which is that they feel very different, and they have different tones to them and themes or foci, and Shemot opens up into both of them. Okay, so until here is basically the first part of what I wanted to say, and I see what time it is. But the first part what I wanted to say, and I'm just going to repeat that again to see if any comments or questions or such, and then try to make a few other observations about the end of Sefer Shemot onto itself. So what we just tried to claim so far is that Sefer Shemot, the end of it, is kind of this fulcrum point. It's a very important point in the Chumash, because it is the point which is the end of Exodus. That's the first point. That's kind of the Ramban's introduction, right? Helped us think about that more. It is the end of Bereshit Shemot. Then it's Siv's introduction helped us think about that. It's also the beginning of 2 other books. It's the beginning of Vayikra, and it's the beginning of Bamidbar, both. And it's a very important moment in the story, both in terms of what we've accomplished so far in the story. Heretofore, by the end of Sefer Shemot, we've accomplished the creation of the world and an attempt to microcosmically imitate them in the Mishkan, to sort of repair and return, as it were, or at least partially, to Gan Eden, to return to the level of the place of the patriarchs, but also to fully return, or partially fully, if you could say such a thing, to return and to be redeemed from the exile and the enslavement, right, of the Avdut of Galut Mitzrayim and the Geulah from it via Mount Sinai and the covenant. So that's where we've gotten, and where we're going are an attempt to live with God, right, by Sefer Vayikra, and 2, with holiness and purity, and 2, to try to get to the land, right, and to travel with the people as a camp and get away to the land. Let me pause here. Reactions, comments, questions, anything.
That the Mishkan is multifaceted, that it does both.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, none of these are mutually exclusive, and the Chumash, remember, holds as a Chumash, right? It's like it has both Vayikra and Bamidbar, just to be clear, right? So yes, absolutely. The Mishkan has multiple purposes, apparently. So yes, Sandra, please.
So I'm struck now that we looked back at Sefer Breshit also through the lens of Sefer Shemot, and there in chapter 6, when God and Noah, when God sought to destroy what He had created, and we see that again, don't we, at Har Sinai, when the people He had chosen and the people He redeemed, he's already made an Am Segulah. He's already broken down the family of men from this size to a smaller inverted ziggurat size. So now he's got the Am, and even that I don't know if he'd say, Ramin Urav, maybe not as bad as they were in Breshit when he said, okay, I'm going to destroy the whole world. Nichamti, he regrets building the world. But here he was at that same, hard to say, what do they call it, kaviyachol, he's at that same despairing point where at first he's going to pick Noach, and Noach is going to be the representative, and because God messed up or the people messed up. And then we see a similar scenario in Shemot when He has saved them. He has pulled them out of the depths of the quicksand, and look what they've done. They've disappointed Him too, and so He's ready to take Moshe and make him the representative. So what I'm seeing now, because of your schematic, is it's not only looking backwards and forwards, it's also intrinsically itself. Is that telling us that this is an inevitable thing?
I don't know. We'll leave that as a question. I don't know if it's inevitable or not, but I think your observation is excellent. It's right, for sure, right? And Moshe says, like, no. Like, if you're going to do that, just wipe me out of your book.
Parenthesis, like you did in Genesis when you cleared out.
Exactly, right. That right, exactly. And God, by Nacham Hashem, right? Eventually, God, decided not to, right? Just like revoking God's despairing regret over creating creating the world to begin with. So yeah, for sure, there is that repetition as well. Thank you. Yeah, for sure. I don't know if it's endemic or not.
Thank you. No answer.
It does seem to happen a lot, huh? Does seem to happen a lot. Yeah. So I guess we could sort of start to close out our time together here with a few more points. And one thing to note is that it's true, right? And the end of Exodus, right, picks up from everything came before it. It leads forward to two different directions and two different potential next chapters. Those next chapters are Leviticus 1 and basically Numbers 9 more, not Numbers 1, unfortunately. But that's basically two different potential next chapters. But it also is the end of the book itself. So I think it's interesting that the book ends, right, not with God speaking to Moshe, meaning the cloud comes down, Moshe can't enter, Vayikra Moshe. That's the beginning of Leviticus, right? But no, the book actually ends with Moshe not able to enter and not able to hear from God. And I think that's, first of all, something to take note of, and it's an interesting. You're part of my, kaviyachol, my phrasing here, but it's an interesting editorial choice, right? like writer's choice or by God, that the Chumash, that the Sefer Shemot ends on that note. Why did it not end with Vayikra, right? That God speaks to Moshe. First of all, I think it's an important question to consider. And perhaps, by the way, that's related to the fact with this, the focus here is on the cloud. I was thinking about how the cloud is such a prominent biblical It's also, by the way, extra biblical in ancient Near Eastern, but let's talk about Bible for now. Biblical, it's basically a representation for God's presence. So God rides in the clouds, rochev ba'aravot, right? God rides in the clouds, but God's also sort of seems to be within the cloud, or the cloud represents God, or it's associated with God's kavod, something along those lines. And the cloud does two things which work in opposite directions, if you will. On the one hand, they signify God's presence, right? So if you see the cloud and the cloud comes down the Mishkan, that's a form of revelation. Okay, that's how you know God is there. God is showing God's self, God's presence, or God's kavod at least, to the people, but or to whoever sees the cloud. And God fills up the entire Mishkan. On the one hand, it's sort of it's a revelatory thing. On the other hand, it's also like just the opposite. A cloud is cloudy, right? A cloud conceals, okay, and you actually can't see within it, and that is speaks to this thing we call God, which is both utterly transcendent and also immanent, is totally mysterious, tremendously mysterious, but also something that apparently can interface and wants to interface with us and with the human being. So the cloud kind of does both, but on that second point especially, it's there, it fills the Mishkan, but Moshe can't interact with God there, right? Moshe can't get there, and Sefer Shemot actually ends on that point. Now, is that merely a cliffhanger to encourage you to open Sefer Vayikra, or is it saying something about the Mishkan? And here I want to make a suggestion: the Mishkan as opposed to the garden. Like we talk about the Mishkan as a potential, second take at the Garden of Eden, and I want to suggest, this is really just a suggestion. I might think differently tomorrow, but I'm thinking that there's always this question, can we ever get back to Eden? And I feel like different moments in the tradition gesture in different towards different answers. Sometimes it sounds like Chadesh Yeminu Kekedem, but there is a way back into the garden. But remember that there's a cherub there, and there's a flaming sword, and we're all mortal now, and we're all exposed to dot, to knowledge. It's not clear that we can actually get back all the way. Maybe we can recreate elements of it, but I want to suggest that for the book of Shemot, it ends with not speech, but with inability to access, because it's true God can be among you, but it's not as you're not going to hear God, call of God mitalech, walking in the garden in the same way, right? You're actually not really able to enter and coexist with God as freely, let's say it that way, as freely as in the garden. So that's how the book of Exodus ends. I would argue the human being, can aspire to have God dwell amongst us, create that space, do the malacha to allow for that, live with God, live with holiness and blessing, etc., etc., etc. Live a godly life. God can even be amongst you, but not with sort of the complete access as we have in the garden. Yeah, Debbie.
I was thinking you had mentioned parallels from the beginning and the ending with the Mishkan and Arei Miskanot and stuff like that. Well, at the beginning, Hashem wasn't with us. Yeah. Hashem hadn't heard, Vayeda, Vayiskor, Vayishma, that whole thing. So here Hashem is again there, but not available to some, or we are not available to him. And yet it's like a reverse. In other words, he's there, but we can't connect. Whereas at the beginning, he wasn't there and we couldn't connect. Right. So it's like a reverse image type thing.
Right. That's how. Yeah, and certainly progress, meaning it's certainly redemption, right? There's been Sinai.
Right.
There's
absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
But I guess what I'm saying is that ultimately, can we return to Eden or not? I would argue the end of Sefer Shemot says no. The beginning of Vayikra says that God called on to Moshe, right, and spoke to him from the Ohel Moed. And there's different, and this is beyond the scope of our time, but it's actually on your source sheet. I was thinking we might get to it, but if not, it's good Torah to have on your source sheets, right? It's unclear how do we resolve the two, right? Was Moshe ever able to enter? Was he not able? Was he hanging out by the door, listening? Was it when the cloud left, right? Then he went in, etc. Rashi, Ramban, Chazal. You can take a look at it. There's one cute midrash there, and I'll end in just 1 or 2 minutes. But there's a cute midrash there which says that, right? Because how could it be, right? If there's a cloud and God's glory is filling the whole thing, there's no room for Moshe even. But it's also totally inappropriate for Moshe to enter into the throne, into the room when God is there. So, how does he get in there? So God, just like at so at Sinai, at least God did this, and maybe at the sea, God sort of like pulled Moshe in, grabbed him and pulled, or maybe at the sea, right? Betoch, like when he went Betoch Hayam, there was a parting of the way, a parting of the sea, making a path. So maybe that also happened in the cloud, that the cloud's there, but God invited Moshe in at times and made a cloud and invited Moshe in. So be that
I have the same question with when it says he has a masveh on. Did he have that on when Hashem is speaking to him? It seems unclear to me when he wore that, when he wasn't teaching,
when he
or
spoke
when
to
he
people,
was, or
he spoke to the people, he took it off, right? But I don't know about when God, after Sinai. This is a good question. I think I want to end with the following. There's much more to say, of course, but this is a quick shear, but just to get us thinking. But I think I'll end with the following, that we said that God appears throughout the Bible on clouds. We speculate as to why that might be, and there is this interesting time where one person can enter the Holy of Holies, and it's one time a year, or only through one particular ritual, and that is in Parashat Acharei Mot. This is the Kohen Gadol, right, or Aaron, or whoever it is, Aaron and his sons can enter in, and there it says, especially after the death of Nadav and Abihu. So the Torah warns, right? God warns, Acharei Mot Shnei Bnei Aharon, when they just entered willy-nilly, without following the proper protocol, without being invited in. So there they enter, and they said, God says to Moshe, say to Aaron, your brother, this is chapter 16 of Vayikra. But they can't come whenever they want, b'cholei tel hakodesh, b'beit la parochet, etc., etc. V'lo yamut ki be'anan eireh al hakaporet, right? Because ki be'anan eireh al hakaporet, rather do the following ritual, which we call the avoda, right, for Yom Kippur. By the way, just a footnote to my footnote here, but Purim's coming up, and the Zohar talks about Purim as Yom Kippur, as Yom Kippurim, and this is one of those moments, right? We have a person alone who is charged with trying to enter into this throne room, following the proper ritual and the proper clothing, etc., in order to beseech, the monarch, the king, the deity, deity in our case, right? For the sake of the people and to appease this person. So you see, right, Esther is basically the Kohen Gadol. This is not the Inkan Makom Harich. That's another share. But what I do want to say here is that this Ki Ba'anan Eireh al Hakaporet, I'm going to end with this. There's a Rashi even brings different readings of what this might mean, right? One possibility is Ki Ba'anan Eireh al Hakaporet is the reason that the Aaron and his sons can't enter whenever they want. They can't enter whenever they want because I am appearing there in the cloud. I got him there. My presence is there. And you can't enter when God's presence is there. Moshe couldn't enter when God's presence filled the whole Mishkan, right? But you can't just enter whenever you want because God is present. But the other Chazal read it, the other possibility is, no. Ki be'anan, meaning ki in the sense of rather. Rather, when can you enter? When will I appear to the priest? In the cloud. What cloud is that? The cloud of the Ketorah, the cloud of the incense, which they are to offer, right, in the Holy of Holies, right, to create the cloud there. So you have there both elements. On the one hand, the thing which keeps them out, right, the cloud, God's cloud, but also the humanly constructed cloud. I have to give credit to my colleague Rabbi Daniel Nevins. He pointed this out, right, Daniel Nevins, that this cloud is a cloud which facilitates, right, the interaction with God, which allows the human into this space, but this is a cloud which is created by the human and not created by, right, not God's cloud, which comes from below. So it's the human cloud actually which allows the human to enter in, right, just like the Mishkan is created by the human, interact with God, despite the Anan of God itself. Okay, more to say. But I think we'll pause here. Thank you very much for learning with me and being with us
Thank
today.
you.
Thank you. I'll hang on for a minute or two if anybody wants to chat more, but otherwise, please join us next week for next week's year. If I don't see you beforehand, have a happy Purim. And we all know what a year it's been, but Purim is still occurs, and it's something to celebrate. So, Purim Shemini.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kelsen. Thank you,
Thank
everyone
you.
who joined us, not only here on Zoom, but also on Drisha Live on Facebook. And for next week's class, we have Rabbi David Silber, who will be teaching on Vayikra. And Debbie, are you wanting to chat for a few more minutes?
No,
No, you're good? Okay, sounds good. So we will close for today. And
Great.
Rabbi Kelsen, I'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Yay, thank you. Bye-bye.